The Acura ZDX is more than just 100% electric, it's 100% Acura energy. With nearly 500 horsepower and an impressive range rating, the ZDX Type S delivers 100% excitement and brings unprecedented performance to the Type S family. And it's 100% loaded with innovative features like an 18-speaker Bang & Olufsen premium sound system, available hands-free cruise, and Google built-in. Test drive the Acura ZDX and unlock electrified performance today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and no, this is not a repeat of last week's podcast, even though Ferraris win, this time with Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen and Lando Norris' battle and what went on in the stewards' room were the headlines. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit the major talking points of the Mexican Grand Prix are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, I guess we should warn people, Scott, as this is Mexico, there's lots of random noises going around in our hotel room at the moment, you may hear in the background, although the fireworks have stopped at least.
Yeah, I can't tell. I've got fireworks from one side of the hotel, and there appears to be some kind of loud banging dispute going on in the hallway at the same time on the other side. So it is, I don't know.
Is it Lando and Max?
I don't think so. It could be an incredibly loud protest on all sides at the fate of Sergio Perez's Grand Prix weekend. Maybe it's some kind of protest at that.
Well, there's obviously a lot of support for him in our hotel because there's a number of cardboard cutouts of Sergio Perez in various trims, some in race overalls. There's even one where he's cutting a rather James Bond-esque figure in a dinner jacket. So, you can't go very far in Mexico City without seeing Sergio Perez in some form, whether it's cardboard or merchandise or advertising, various things he's connected to. Cannot underestimate how huge a star he is here. But, we won't get into how well that turned out on track right now. Mark, obviously you've not been on site, but you've been following extremely closely. As always, how have you enjoyed it? Is it one you miss not being on the ground for?
It's always a nice buzz in that particular paddock, isn't it? But the race, it was a good one. It was a good tense one, and it came up with another new storyline, didn't it? Even though part of it was a reprise from last week in Austin, the Carlos Sainz storyline was a really, really nice one.
Yeah, I think plenty of people were very, very pleased to see Carlos Sainz making sure he at least gets one more Ferrari victory before he heads off. I think Sainz himself indicated the same sort of thing. But we've got a huge amount to get through, so we shall pile through. And Scott, we have got to start with the big controversy of the race, which was once again Max Verstappen and Lando Norris' battle. 2 penalties for Max Verstappen, 1 for forcing Norris off track at turn 4, and 1 for the turn 7 attempted pass. What did you make of them?
I thought both of them were obviously with Max transgressing. The first one was at least a legitimate attempt to contest the corner, and to be honest, I could have taken or left that as a penalty. Norris got ahead in doing so. Obviously, he accidentally jumped the second of the Ferraris, didn't he, in the process, but let that one back through. But rightly, if it was only briefly, stayed ahead of Verstappen. So I felt like they could have let that go if they wanted to. But I guess to the letter of the law, if you force someone off track, it doesn't matter what happens to them. You've still transgressed. And I don't know. I don't think it was linked to last weekend, but given all the attention and focus on the racing guidelines and what the stewards are doing and whether they're applying things, whether there's some leniency for Verstappen, whatever, maybe just following the letter of the law was necessary on this occasion. The second one, slam dunk, no question at all. You can't race that kind of approach. And I think everything that was said after the race by Lando, by Max, by Red Bull's Christian Horner indicated that they all knew it was Max acting in retaliation, a bit desperately, just to prove a point because he felt that Norris was wrongly ahead of him and he was nowhere near making the corner, and therefore it was completely right that he got penalised for it. The only thing I didn't understand from it all is why Red Bull and Verstappen didn't just yield the position back to Norris, because I felt that would have at least gained them a 10-second penalty removed, and that's a lot of race time given how the rest of the Grand Prix played out. It probably cost him a couple of positions doing it like that.
Yeah, exactly. A total of 20 seconds pit stop penalty was not very helpful. Mark, what do you reckon?
I think I take Scott's point about why didn't they give it back, but I think there was also an element of tactics involved in Max's approach towards Norris, in that it didn't really matter that he was compromising his own race, because as far as he was concerned, he was going to get beaten by the McLaren anyway because it had so much more pace, as he'd just seen. And so the mission became to compromise Norris's race as far as possible. It's very much with the backdrop of Max having that big points lead. So, any contact between them is to his advantage. And I think the second move was done in anger, I think, at coming out behind when he feels he should have been in front. But I think it was also done with in his mind. His whole mentality is that he just has to work the rules to his advantage in a way which will nullify as far as possible Norris's race.
Yeah, and I think overall, I'm in agreement with Scott. I think these were justifiable and reasonable penalties, a bit different to the situations last week. Mark, are you happy with the fact there's 20 seconds of penalties across these two?
Yeah, I think it was fair. I think it was, the first one, was he ahead at the apex? I really need to see that in sort of frame by frame detail. But certainly Norris was ahead before the apex and well ahead, but then, was Max actually axle slightly in front? In which case, the corner's his as long as he doesn't go off the track. So that, presumably the stewards had looked at that and decided he wasn't ahead at the apex, otherwise that wouldn't have been a penalty. The second one was just ridiculous. And I looked at the telemetry of that particular, how he did that corner, and compared it to his normal laps. And he's 60 metres later on the brakes than on his normal lap, and 100 metres later off the throttle. So there's absolutely no way he was making the corner from that compromised inside line anyway. He's never intended to take that corner. And then, he passed by leaving the track, then it's a slam dunk. So, yeah.
It's funny that you bring up the telemetry, Mark, because when obviously Christian Horner brought out the telemetry in defence of Verstappen's penalty for the Turn 4 incident, arguing that Norris was never going to make the corner, he'd brake this much later, he'd carried this much more speed in, blah, blah, blah. He rather conveniently didn't make that same claim for the Turn 8 incident. Decided not to fight Verstappen's corner with telemetry there, probably because of exactly what you've just explained. The telemetry is damning for Verstappen in that case.
I have to say, the fact, Mark, you referred to needing to look through it frame by frame tells you how tricky it is having this kind of absolute precise measure. So drivers are supposed to judge that in real time from the cockpit, whether you're 5 millimetres the right side or the wrong side. And that's my concern with the guidelines. But yeah, with the way things are working, perfectly reasonable. Penalties, inevitably, there's a deluge of the Race Members Club questions on this. So we're going to power through a bunch of them in this section related to the controversy to come at it from various different angles. So Scott, first for you from Ben Gary, why was Max penalised for pushing Lando wide in the first of the two incidents this weekend, yet avoided a penalty last week?
because there was a key difference between the two, which is what Mark alluded to, and that was the position at the apex. Last week at Austin, while obviously McLaren and Norris felt that different rules should have applied because they felt that Norris had technically got ahead just before turn 12 in Austin, the stewards didn't view it that way and was judging it so both incidents gets judged as Norris attempting an overtake on the outside. At Austin, because Verstappen braked so much later, Norris was not level with Verstappen at the apex to the exit, which is the requirement of the guidelines if you're overtaking on the outside. So Verstappen wasn't obligated to leave Norris racing room, and because of the way the guidelines are now versus where they were a couple of years ago, Verstappen also wasn't even required to remain on track himself. So the fact that he forced Norris off and left the track all four wheels over the white line himself didn't matter from Verstappen's point of view, and made Norris's move illegal, because all it did is ensured that Norris was passing him off track. The key difference here is that Norris, I thought, showed he'd learned from last week, braked a lot later, was a lot more committed to that outside move. I think Max was also slightly restricted in where he could brake because there was obviously a Ferrari in front, so had to be a little bit wary of completely cleaning him out. And Norris was alongside pretty much, as Mark said, you'd need to super slow-mo it in a lot of detail to know exactly how they were, but near as makes no difference as far as the stewards were concerned, alongside at the apex. And then crucially, the way Norris rolled off the brakes and carried the speed into the corner meant that by the time Verstappen ran him out of road, Norris was also still alongside him, so completely entitled to racing room, which Verstappen didn't give him. So even though Norris then went off the track and obviously briefly rejoined ahead, Verstappen was done for forcing another car off the track. It was all down to that apex positioning, which was obviously went against Norris last week, counted in his favour this week.
Mark, a mashup of two questions for you. Kevin King asks, do you think any other drivers would have received a 10-second penalty for the same offences? In my eyes, the penalties received seem to be trying to undo the effects from the last race. And Ben Clarkson asks, why did Verstappen get a 10-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage? But in Austin, Norris only received 5 seconds for the same type of incident.
I'll answer the second question first. The 5-second penalty that Norris got last week, the stewards explained, included a notional penalty for Verstappen as well. So, in other words, Norris's penalty, which would normally have been 10 seconds, was reduced to 5 seconds because of the part Verstappen had played in it. So it was like a net 5 seconds, whereas that wasn't the case this time. Would anyone other than Verstappen have got 10-second penalty for that? Absolutely, the second one, without question. Any one of the 20 drivers tried that, and they would come down like on a ton of bricks, because it's incontestable. You just go into the corner on the inside with no intention of making the corner just to get ahead of the other guy. Well, that doesn't count, does it? And that's just so obvious. It doesn't really even need some very specific rules to count. You're racing on a different circuit to everybody else. Obviously, that doesn't count. So yeah, any one of the drivers would have got it for that. And as for the first one, as I say, I'm not quite sure. I would need to see more frame by frame detail.
As on the 10-second penalty, it's also worth stressing that obviously last year it would have been 5 seconds. The standard penalty was increased to 10 seconds for this year for pretty much every offence, because it was felt that 5 seconds just wasn't enough of a deterrent. So it wasn't a harsher penalty either. It was 10 seconds because that's what, as Mark said, any of the 20 drivers would get for that kind of offence, apart from in certain circumstances like Norris a week ago where there was mitigation effectively, so it was actually reduced. It would have been 10 seconds in normal circumstances.
Right, quadruple question, in fact, I'll take. From the Dutch defence, why is Max in destroyer mode with such a big championship lead? Ryan Norrie says, surely at this stage in the championship, Max just needs to race sensibly and stay as close to Norris as he can. Why is he racing so desperately and not tactically? I know it's not in his nature, but it all seems very daft to me. Michael Sooley asks, will Max ever learn? And Andrew Dale says, will Verstappen finally adjust his over-aggressive style, or will he continue to force the stewards to step in to penalise him? Well, on the tactical approach, Mark's alluded to one of the reasons why it was potentially to Verstappen's benefit to hinder Norris as well. So you could argue there's some tactical thinking there. I think that also Max has a fairly straightforward view of racing. I'm not sure he's prone to racing, especially tactically generally. I do think there are maybe times when he should do. And I think he probably would have been better off not lumbering himself with 20 seconds worth of penalties that meant he finished further down. So perhaps didn't help himself there. So I just think it's how he races. That's why he probably won't change. And I think his style will remain. He thinks it's the right way to do it. He's keen to do it. I personally, were I in his position, take a slightly different view and probably would be a little bit broader and tactical in the way I approach it. But that's the approach he takes. That's entirely up to him. He plays the game the way he wants.
I'd be interested very quickly to see what you two think of this. When I spoke to Max after the race, and I asked him, because there's obviously been this massive focus on the racing guidelines, and said to him, will you basically race to whatever guidelines you're given? Do you have a preference for what you want them to be? Or effectively, are you just driving the way you drive, and then whether they match the guidelines or not is just depending on what the stewards say? And he kind of indicated it was the latter. So I was wondering if the way it played out today versus Austin last week, did we give him a bit too much credit last week, and actually he was just lucky that he didn't transgress so much that he broke the guidelines, and then this week he was on the wrong side of that? I still think he knows the rules and does try to drive to them and just push them really hard, and that's what he was trying to do in the first incident with Norris today, whereas the second one was, I think, as we all agree, hot-headed, bit of a head loss, the kind of thing Max can do when he's lost control of something and just wants to kind of have a bit of retribution on his own terms. What do you two think?
I think his judgment is fine enough that he's very much capable of, as he put it at the weekend, play with the rules. He said, I don't make the rules, but I do play with them. And he's good enough and smart enough to actually dissect what that means. And he knows in his head what he can do in extremis in order to have sort of plausible deniability, if you like.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. But, of course, there are times when maybe he goes a little bit too far, as he did at turn 7, when I think that was very much in reaction, as we've talked about. Scott, James Nicholson asks, do Red Bull ever chastise Max for his driving when he was in the wrong? And Juan Aravalo asks, what are the chances Red Bull will ask Verstappen to drive closer to the rulebook?
I don't think any chance on the second point, because I don't think Red Bull bothers wasting their time trying to get through to Verstappen in that way. I think the only person Max has ever listened to in F1 in terms of his driving style and approach is his father. I think Jos intervened, didn't he, in 2018 when Max got involved in all those incidents at the start of the season. Apart from that, I think Christian Horner knows that it's kind of futile, and I think Helmut Marko doesn't really have any interest in telling Max to, because it plays in Max's favour more often than it doesn't. So they kind of leave him to it, and then that comes back to the first point: do they ever chastise him? Not in public. Not a lot of team bosses do, to be fair, especially with their star drivers. There's a bit of a code you can decipher with the way that Horner speaks about Verstappen. We've talked about it a bit before. If he's saying it's a racing incident, he's basically saying that Max was to blame. And in the case of today, both the incidents, he was very defensive of Max on the first one, and then on the second one, which was obviously very clearly Max's fault, Horner kind of begrudgingly, in a very roundabout way, said, you can kind of see why they might give a penalty for that, which is as close as he'll come to saying that Max deserves a penalty. In private, maybe he'll have a word from time to time, but it's not a big thing. There's not a huge... It's just not how that dynamic works. It's not set up to police Max. Max is beyond reproach, I think, within the Red Bull structure.
Mark William Breen says, it seems like Verstappen is just trying to crash into Norris at this point. What options does Norris have to keep making positions up on Verstappen in this title fight? How do you even continue to race? Jasper Pendlebury asks, why is Max racing Lando worse than he raced Lewis Hamilton back in 2021? And Chris Ngandu says, is Verstappen calculating when he decides to do crazy moves? They only seem to come out against title rivals.
Yeah, I think there is some calculation in those moves. Just as there was towards the end of 21 with Lewis Hamilton. I don't think he's racing worse than he was against Hamilton in terms of professional fouls, if you like. I think his moves in Brazil turned 4 and 21, and two of the incidents in Jeddah and in 21 were pretty outrageous. So I don't see that he's got more outrageous in this title fight. But yeah, it's not a coincidence that it's these moves coming out against his title rival. It's the same mentality, and it's the same line of thinking.
And a cool set of questions I'll take from first Richard Randall. A world champion should be a role model in all aspects. But is it fair to say that Max Verstappen's driving on occasion is not that of a role model? Rob O says, surely this is going too far. You can't force another driver off the track consistently during a race. And Fabian H asks, why is it that when Verstappen's involved, there is almost always drama or incidents? And Jack Lund says, I have no doubt that Max is the fastest and best driver on the grid, but is this race more proof he cannot accept being beaten and instead turns to literally driving people off? Well, he's uncompromising, isn't he, Verstappen? He's got a very clear belief in what he can do. He is generally very certain in his own righteousness. He's far from the first world champion level driver to be that way, to be uncompromising, to be ruthless, to be absolutely certain that they are in the right. And I think that's kind of an important part of his makeup, and that's why he is going to end up getting caught up in drama or accidents, and also he's racing at the front of F1. There's a lot at stake. So, yeah, I think he doesn't like being beaten. I don't think he turns to driving people off if he's at risk of being beaten, but he will fight hard. Role model, that is a tricky one. Verstappen will argue he should be true to himself, and I think ultimately, when it comes to a sporting event, you're playing to rules, aren't you? And how you approach those rules, how you use them to your advantage, how you dance with them, flirt with them, is kind of up to you. Now, should a world champion be a role model in all aspects? Ideally, but different characters, different people. I don't necessarily think he has to be held to some impossible standard on that. I think you choose your role models, don't you? Some people will choose Max Verstappen and love all the characteristics he brings. Some people will want someone who doesn't push it so hard. So, yeah, I wouldn't say he's the absolute optimum role model for exactly how I would approach racing necessarily, but that who am I to say whether that one's right? Scott, a question from James Godfrey Moon for you. Using Max's antics as an example, should there not be a harsher penalty available for blatant unsportsmanlike conduct, like in other sports like football? And John Ayers asks, how close did Max Verstappen get to a black flag?
Well, there are harsher penalties available, and actually the second part of that, John's question, there's the black flag, disqualification is the ultimate kind of penalty. It would have been, I think it would have been harsh, but it was possible for them to impose a bigger time penalty, a drive-through penalty, a stop and go. All those penalties do exist, but the problem with unsportsmanlike conduct and judging, what people do in racing situations is you're trying to guess intent. And look, we can all say with a great degree of certainty that Verstappen was never making the corner when on that second move on Norris, which is the egregious one. But can you say he's never making the corner and there's no way of doing it? Yeah, you can probably say that as well. Can you say that he did it thinking it would work? As in, would he get away with it, not get a penalty? No, I'm pretty sure he knew he'd get a penalty. He got the penalty and he served it. That is kind of how the system exists to operate. I don't think in that scenario it went so far as to need a massive penalty in terms of unsportsmanlike behaviour. I think that needs to be reserved for repeat offences of the same kind. Now, there were two in close succession here that were very similar, but they weren't the same, and it wasn't like an escalation over several incidents that would merit some kind of like accrual of penalties then dished out as one big one. I think actually in hindsight, if you go back to the end of 2021, some of Max's driving there probably, like Jeddah, for example, is where he very much crossed the line in 2021 and probably merited a bigger penalty than any kind of standard in-race time penalty. certainly more than 5 seconds, which would have been how it was at the time. So there are methods to do that. I don't think it was required on this occasion.
And the final question I'll take on this topic from Jacobus VDL is Verstappen picking up licence point penalties for the wild moves he has pulled on Norris in the last 2 races? And do you think that the prospect of a race ban towards the end of the season will restrain his driving in any way? Well, he had 2 points coming into the weekend. That's for forcing Leclerc off at Vegas last year. That expires in a couple of weeks, though. So he had 2. He got another 2 today for the turn 4 incident. Didn't get anything for the turn 7 one. And why would he get any for Austin? Because he wasn't penalised in Austin, so there's no reason he'd have got licence points. So he's only on 4, and I don't think for 1 minute the prospect of a race ban would make much difference to the way Max races on track.
Victorinox, the makers of the original Swiss Army knife, have been a reliable companion for life's everyday challenges, mastering functionality, innovation, iconic design, and uncompromising quality with its products. The Victorinox Swiss Army knife provides you with all the things you don't think about until you need it: tweezers, a screwdriver, and even a corkscrew. With the Victorinox Swiss Army knife, you can be prepared to master everyday life. You can find Victorinox Swiss Army knives at Dick's Sporting Goods.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Right, well, we've got through the controversy, Mark, but let's come to the traditional question for you that normally opens a podcast. Can you explain how the race played out and why it was Carlos Sainz who did the winning this time when it was Charles Leclerc last time?
Yeah, Ferrari's still on that lovely vein of form that they've had since their Monza upgrade, and it's a very, very fast car now. It works everywhere. Although Sainz pointed out that he doesn't expect to be on pole in Qatar because its weakness is still high speed corners, and you saw a little hint of that actually in the middle curvy sector of Mexico, where it was definitely only the third fastest car, but it was the quickest over the lap. It's just very, very good now, and the difference between Sainz and Leclerc. 2 factors there. One, as Leclerc himself said, the way he pushes, the way his aggressive style with the car, the natural way he drives doesn't seem to work very well on low downforce tracks for him. He just never really got as comfortable with the balance of the car. On Mexico, you run a high downforce wing. The actual effect is low downforce because of the very thin air. So it's a low downforce track in effect in terms of the grip that you have. So, the car and the circuit combination was a much better match for Sainz than it was for Leclerc, but also, of course, Leclerc had to miss FP1 because it was his turn to hand the car over to Junior, Oliver Behrman, and of course Behrman was involved in that accident with Alex Albon, which damaged the car enough that Leclerc was late in joining FP2, so very little track running before Saturday, so that contributed as well, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, at one point he was chasing down the gap to Sainz, but I think we'll talk a little bit about what was going on there later on. But in reality, Sainz always had his number all weekend.
And of course, Charles Leclerc ran second and then slipped to third behind Norris when he had that mistake at the final corner. He said that he felt it was inevitable he was going to be passed anyway. Do you think that's correct, Scott? Do you think Leclerc was always going to fall victim to Norris?
It did look like that, the way the race ended up playing out. I think if Norris hadn't lost so much race time early on with the Verstappen incidents and then being stuck behind other cars, I think there's a decent chance Norris would have won this race. I think the McLaren was the faster car in race trim in the end, but only by a small margin. I think Sainz was a fantastically deserving winner of this Grand Prix. Brilliant weekend performance. Qualifying, I thought, was superb. I think I said to you, Ed, afterwards, it's not just the fact that he got ahead of that group. I love the fact that he put 2 temps on everybody. That's just such a satisfying qualifying margin, I think. Especially when
when you did 2 laps good enough for pole.
Yeah, and then obviously there's been a lot of attention in recent weeks of like Verstappen overperforming in the Red Bull, Leclerc being so good in the Ferrari, Norris's lap in Austin, for example. Just great time for Sainz to show what he's capable of. And also, given how long we spent debating the controversy and the race and the incidents in the first section of this podcast, we're not going to, but I feel we could, between the three of us, probably devote 20 minutes to dissecting and praising Sainz's overtake on Verstappen in this Grand Prix, because that was so good. That does not happen very often, when someone catches Verstappen unawares like that and actually gets it done. I think if you're looking at, if you were trying to put together a case study in the art of overtaking Max Verstappen, that's the dream. What Sainz did down into turn 1, absolutely perfect. So yeah, just love the way that he did this. Basically, did a great job in qualifying. Had to do it the hard way in the race by overtaking Verstappen on track, and then was just simply too good from there. Made the most of it and got the job done.
The thing I really liked in that overtake on Verstappen, which was brilliantly executed, there's that moment where he has the presence of mind to realise he's kind of heading for a track cut in turn 2 and adjusts, which was really, really good presence of mind, because it's extremely easy not to. Funnily enough, he was saying, when you're in battle, it's not very easy to think about where you're positioning relative to the track edges, to this, that and the other, but he did it there, and I know it was fairly obvious because it's the inside track cut's a bit different to the outside one, but it's been very easy not to do that. I thought it was fantastic.
It was a very good correction of what was a very unusual error to see someone almost make. I don't know whether he thought he was going to have a ton of understeer in the Ferrari, or if he just slightly lost where he was on the circuit. But it was quite amusing, because obviously when you first saw it, you clocked it from the outside. It was the external camera, wasn't it, from the trackside? So you saw the car sort of go left back and then take the corner again, and it was just like, what the hell's happened there? And it goes on board, and it obviously makes a lot of sense, but it was a strange one that he did well to correct as quickly as he did.
And Mark, Carlos Sainz, we can't really praise him highly enough. This was an outstanding weekend for him. When he has these kinds of weekends, he is so good, just ticks every box, doesn't he? The only thing you could say is, could you have avoided that grassy moment at the first corner? But other than that, just fantastic. Really, really on top of everything.
Yeah, and I think even that first corner moment, he's hanging on around the outside of Verstappen in the full knowledge that he has got an escape route there, and he probably knew he was going to have to take it once he decided to try and go around the outside of Verstappen. You know, probably with 90% certainty that you're going to be having to leave the track, but that's a pretty well-used bit of grass, and relatively harmless if you take it at the right angle, and he did, and then backed off and give the place back. So I wouldn't really call that an error. I'd just call that as where he had to position himself almost, because don't forget Norris was right there behind him, and had he tried to take it another way, he might have ended up losing out to Norris. So at least he avoided that. I mean, Sainz on his good day is as good as anybody in the world, and this was one of his good days. And Sainz on a bad day is still pretty good. So, I think he doesn't get as much recognition as I think he deserves, but he's, consistently in the last, 5 years, he's been one of the top handful of Grand Prix drives and remains that.
And of course, Scott, Carlos Sainz had probably given up hope of being part of a Ferrari championship earlier this season, but the Constructors' Championship, they're 29 points behind McLaren now. Last week we said, yeah, they're in it. Now they're right in the thick of it, aren't they? Ferrari absolutely going toe-to-toe for this Constructors' Championship. And this is quite significant because if they don't win it this year, this will be their new record for the longest drought without a championship. I think they're in 15 seasons between 83 and 99, 15 seasons between 2008 when they got the last Constructors and this year if you count it up to the end of last year. But they can stop having a 16th year of that drought. They really could do it, couldn't they?
Yeah, the way that it's gone over the last couple of events, it's not just... I mean, obviously the point swing has been massive and extremely significant. But I think the fact that they've done it on these circuits, having sort of got themselves into that peripheral position through the combination of slightly unusual tracks that do suit Ferrari, Monza, Baku and Singapore was quite a nice run for them. But to then keep it going and perform this well on tracks like Austin and the unique challenge of Mexico is significant. I actually asked both the Ferrari drivers after the race about the realistic nature of the Constructors' Championship fight. I also asked if they were in any way surprised by it, given how Red Bull started the year and McLaren dominated or moved into domination in the middle part of the year. I don't think anyone at any point thought, oh yeah, do you know what the team will be to beat by the end of the season? Ferrari. And Leclerc said... Leclerc put it quite nicely where he says it now relies on us doing well more than others doing something wrong, which I think is a really neat way of summing up how it's swung towards Ferrari. And Sainz actually said that it's now become more of an open topic of discussion within the team and between the drivers themselves. They know that there is a bigger goal here to fight for. So it's definitely become more obviously on their radar as a team, as well as obviously a public narrative, but it's properly game on, and it's very impressive how they've managed to do that. They've worked really, really hard and really effectively at eliminating the biggest weaknesses of that car. You know, is that going to be the fastest car over the final races? I suspect not. I suspect McLaren might have the edge, but Ferrari's certainly in the picture enough and has made its car enough of an all-rounder with the quality of its driver lineup. You cannot discount Ferrari now nicking this in the final few races.
Yeah, it's just another element to add to this absolutely fantastic season. Red Bull now down in third place. And to be honest, not looking like they've got any chance of winning the Constructors' Championship right now. Remarkable turnaround. Now, Scott, Verstappen's recovery, what do you make of that? He came back through to 6th. Does this result change your view of the title fight? Norris is now 47 points behind, so that dips under that 2 wins points threshold you were talking about earlier this year.
It has dipped it under that, but there are only 4 races left. I know we still have, is it 1 sprint or 2 sprints?
2 sprints, so there's 120 points left to play for.
Yes, so 2 sprints. It's possible. I still think it's very unlikely, and I think the gains like today are usually about as good as it gets for Norris. So I just don't think it's going to happen. In terms of Verstappen's comeback, fine, got back to where he should have done, really, considering how it played out. I still, I take Mark's point when I raised this earlier that Max kind of almost isn't interested in it. He's probably more interested in proving a point against Norris than he is scoring more points than he could. But he would have had a better comeback, he would have had a better race result if he'd given himself less of a comeback by not having 20 seconds worth of time penalties. And that to me matters more than the job he did thereafter. I think he's still in control of this, obviously. If he has any more moments like this weekend, and I don't really like the phrase head loss. I used it earlier, but it is a very specific situation that Verstappen gets himself in, where it is actually almost a quite appropriate descriptor of what happens. If that occurs again, then maybe Norris will have a bit more of an opening. But right now, I think Brazil, there needs to be Brazil or Qatar, there needs to be like a 15-point swing, like in one single race, not nibbling points out of Verstappen isn't enough anymore. He needs big gains. On average, he needs to gain 12.
11.75.
Yeah, so 12 points. 12 points a race. And how many times this season, Ed, has he gained 12 points on Verstappen?
Yeah, it's only happened a few times. And even if he repeated this gain, that's only an 8-point gain 4 times. That's 32 points, and there's a couple of sprints. So actually, although he has got closer than he's been, it's still not quite close enough because of the few points that are still left to get. It's still it could happen. There's still a chance. He's got to keep maximising it. But yeah, it's there's no. I don't think Norris can't catch that just through doing really well. He could win all the remaining races, and there's a good chance that wouldn't be enough.
I just had a quick look. He hasn't at any point this season. Today was the biggest gain he's made on Verstappen. I think 10 points in a single race. He's gained 8 points a couple of times, but unless I'm missing an obvious one, I don't think I am. 15 points in Australia, because obviously Verstappen retired there. So, you're looking at extreme outcomes like that. But as a general rule, Norris does not gain on Verstappen when both of them finish at all. And he needs to do that 4 times in the final 4 races.
Mark, are you any more optimistic for a title fight breaking out, or is it still just out of reach, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's like one step removed, isn't it? It's only in the numbers that it's there. It's not you can't feel it. You don't sense that it's going to catch fire and become real.
Yeah, exactly. And there's still a vague possibility, but yes, there's not a lot left to go. Right, Scott, disastrous weekend for Sergio Perez, and Oscar Piastri joined him in falling in Q1 and could only recover to 8. So what went wrong for them?
So Piastri first, I think McLaren will rue running on mediums at the start in Q1, but then Piastri should have got through easily and made a needless error on his first lap, and then didn't have the tyres when he tried again on the second lap, having had the first lap deleted for track limits. Set himself up for a difficult race, made this basically same position Norris was in 12 months ago, only this time Piastri didn't quite have the same pace, and crucially didn't have the race circumstances fall in his favour to allow him to make the big gains that Norris did. So a limited recovery, and disappointing, I think, that he couldn't nick. He split the Hasses in the end, didn't he? Couldn't quite get Kevin Magnussen, so that was disappointing. And as for Perez, I mean, where do you start? He is in a crisis of confidence at the moment, and the lack of feeling he seems to have on the brakes is... Do you remember we've seen a couple of times at the start in 22, I think, in 23, where he just seemed a little bit sensitive with the braking on the front axle, locking the fronts, making not silly mistakes, that's a bit unfair, making little mistakes and just struggling really over one lap in qualifying. Well, now that seems to have sort of migrated towards the rear axle. There was some evidence of it on the front axle still in Mexico, but it was the rear axle that was giving him a lot of grief, especially into turn 1. So he's not got the confidence under braking. The rear moves around a little bit. He's sliding through the corners, which is a bit slower, and it's building tyre temperature, so then they're screwed at the end of the lap. And that manifested itself in the worst possible way in Mexico, because as Mark and you, Ed, were explaining earlier, it's a low grip track. So that sliding around and lack of grip and confidence is just exponentially worse than it was in Austin, for example, a week ago. He didn't have 100% of the Red Bull floor upgrade that Verstappen had in Austin, but I believe he did have most of it. So I don't think that explains the full extent of his 8/10th gap in Q1 and Q1 exit. And then in the race, obviously, the most bizarre of grid lining up errors. Now, we've said a few times on this podcast, surprised that doesn't happen more when someone is very slightly out of position on the grid. But Perez was not very slightly out of position on the grid, despite his radio message arguing that he did think he was actually in the right position. Actually had quite a good start in first lap, but obviously picked up that penalty for being out of position at the start. And then obviously quite contentiously for Red Bull, or the Red Bull camp, had the clash with Lawson mid-race as well, which Perez was incensed by. But the stewards didn't take any action over it, and Red Bull didn't seem particularly bothered by it either, which I think was quite telling. Leaves this weekend, I think, has been really bad for Perez. Comes at a terrible, terrible time, but he's just lost out on track and now off it, hasn't he? It's bad enough to be that slow, to have such a bad result at your home Grand Prix, to clash with Lawson the way he has, and then for Red Bull to effectively side with Lawson. By not taking Perez's side, they've indirectly taken Lawson's side. He lost out on all counts this weekend.
Yeah, and it's such a shame that it happened on home soil because he's just such a big star here. So many people came here to see him, and although Sainz had some good support, I discovered that on Saturday when I was waiting to speak to some of the drivers after qualifying. We were quite close to that stadium section, and the cheer that Sainz got on the slowdown lap after he got pole was just absolutely massive. But I'm not sure that's much consolation, given Perez was the one that everyone came to see thrive. And yeah, just a painful weekend for him. Right, Mark, let's move on to Mercedes. Another weekend where the car's problems were clear, one in which Russell again threw the car at the scenery. Anything new to say about that, or is it just more of the same from Merck?
Yeah, I don't think they quite understand it themselves. The car's okay within a sort of driving at 80%. It's quite consistent and it's balanced and what have you. It's not very quick. It's probably half a second off the pace of a Ferrari at the moment. But if you get at all ambitious with it and it strikes the ground at the wrong angle, it's uncontrollable and it just bites. It just seems to surrender all its downforce immediately. And you're a passenger, and we've seen it 3 times in the last 2 races, 4 times in the last 2 races, if you include practices. So yeah, there's something there that they've not uncovered, and it's it will be to do with the tricky little last few millimeters of ground clearance around the choke point or the underfloor, as all these things are with this generation of car. And but it means that they're still floundering with trying to understand these cars for 3 years in succession, with the end of the 3rd year of the formula, and they're still in this position, which is a bit worrying.
Yeah, and also they've got a little bit of a challenge in terms of balancing the cost cap and the need to make parts, given they've had a series of crashes. Antonelli at Monza, then Russell's had a couple. So yeah, there's the parts stores are quite light. They had a split spec this weekend, just as they did in the race in Austin, with Russell on the old package and Hamilton on the new floor. They've got 2 new floors arriving for Brazil. I asked Toto Wolff about that after the race, and he said that he's sure that in Brazil Russell will want to run the new floor, and Lewis Hamilton will get to have a choice. He's not sure. They haven't discussed that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them continuing to split, but maybe it'll be flipped around for Brazil. Right, Scott, let's talk about Yuki Tsunoda. He was actually very quick in that upgraded RB, but sadly also error-prone. Ruined his own qualifying with that crash. Also cost teammate Liam Lawson a shot at Q3. So what did you make of his decision-making on the run to the first corner that led to him and Alex Albon being eliminated barely before the race had started?
It felt like a slightly desperate attempt to make up for the fact that he had screwed up in qualifying, because both those RBs I think should have started in the top 10, and given that it allowed Haas a free pass with both cars into Q3, it wasn't just that he'd hurt his own team, he directly benefited their main championship rival as well, because Haas looked vulnerable in qualifying. So it just felt like, he'd got the run down to turn 1, and he's completely entitled at that point, absolutely, to sniff around and see where the track might open up. But he's already been... the way the cars in front are jostling around, it's Albon alongside the others, and then they catch Pierre Gasly's Alpine into the braking zone. But he's already been put over onto the dirt on the left-hand side once, but he sort of keeps his foot in it. Then the track kind of opens up a little bit in front of him, so he just commits to sending it down the outside. Now, we don't know if he would have made the corner or not. I do fear that braking and trying to get everything slowed down out on the outside curb would have caused him some drama anyway. But unsurprisingly, the bit of track that had opened up then had the corner of a Williams in it, because Gasly's Alpine came across on Albon perfectly legitimately, because that's just the way the cars were fanning out before turn 1. Albon had to move ever so slightly to the left, and because Tsunoda had suddenly put his car there, that caused contact. So it wasn't the most ridiculous move from Tsunoda, and he hasn't caused the contact by moving across on Albon or anything like that. But it just felt like it was needlessly high risk, and put his car in a place where there was just a really decent chance of there being an accident. So like I say, it did just feel a little bit desperate after Saturday to just try and make that ground up instantly in one go at turn one.
Yeah, it was a bit of an optimistic move, but I think I loved his comment afterwards. When he was asked about it, he said, it always ends up like this in Mexico. I don't get past turn one. It's happened the last 3 years. There's something going on here.
What's the common thread, I wonder? Yeah, it's he's so frustrating, Tsunoda, because he can be so good. But yeah, he didn't play the percentages there, and yeah, qualifying was bad. I mean, I think he pretty much knows there's no chance of promotion to Red Bull Racing. Maybe he's overreaching, trying to change that, but yeah, he's not going anywhere with that.
No, I agree, and I think I spoke to a couple of senior people at Red Bull about this sort of around qualifying and the race, and their judgment on the qualifying error, for example, was basically that's why he won't be a Red Bull Racing driver in the future, because the pace is there, the pace can be there, there's no question. But they just feel he's got a mistake in him. And I think Helmut Marko also said, didn't he, that the way that Tsunoda's kind of reacting to the pressure that Liam Lawson's immediately putting him under in that team is reviving the doubts that they had over his, I guess, mental strength, his attitude, however you want to describe it. So, yeah, this was not a good weekend for Tsunoda in the end, despite, as you said at the start, how quick he was. And given it came off the back of Austin, where Lawson had done so well and Tsunoda had a problematic Grand Prix, he's not even an outsider really for the Red Bull seat next year. I think he's going to have his final season in RB, and then he's going to have to go elsewhere because his main backer Honda is obviously splitting from Red Bull at the end of 25. And there's no future for him in that organisation because the top team just does not want him.
Let's sum up the rest of the midfield now, Mark. We had a pretty straightforward battle there. Kevin Magnussen took what you might call Class B honours in 7th. Great weekend for him, backed up by Nico Hülkenberg in 9th. Split by Oscar Piastri, and then Pierre Gasly took the last point in 10th. So is Haas now firmly king of the midfield based on what you saw in Mexico and the preceding races?
It looks as though in that little group of Haas, Williams, RB, Alpine, the Haas is the most consistently fast. The others are fast sometimes, but the Haas is the one that's the really, you put it on the track and it'll be, somewhere around the low reaches of Q3 and well placed to get good points. So yeah, I'd say they're definitely favourite among that little group there.
Yeah, and 15 points they've taken from that weekend. They're now 10 points clear of RB, which is a significant margin with only 4 races to go and relatively minor points to fight for. So, yeah, a fine weekend for them. Really, really good work from Kevin Magnussen. And now, Scott, quickly, we've not been there for a while, shall we?
Despite all the best intentions and attempts not to, I think we need to.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
Right, Scott, why are we here? Why are we so sympathetic to poor old Valtteri after his 14th place finish?
He just didn't deserve to finish 14th. He didn't deserve to qualify 15th. He was really quick this weekend. He drove really well, but qualifying just went away from him at the last moment, having got the slowest car on the grid into Q2. And I suspect I don't think he was getting into Q3. He could have had a nibble at like 12th or 13th maybe, but he didn't get his run because of the red flag. So he went through all of that and did a really good job on Saturday to start one place higher than he would have done if he'd got knocked out in Q1, which is just so out of order. And then in the race, obviously, he was just... I mean, there's not a huge amount of gravity around where the Saubers tend to run, but he was still fighting it. And this was just as good as it was going to get. He reckoned if he'd started where he felt he could have qualified, he might have been able to beat Ocon's Alpine. But 14th is as good as it gets in a Sauber. And it shouldn't have been. This was a weekend where if that team was just
any good,
a little bit more competitive.
Any good at all.
Yeah, pretty much. Like these are the weekends where Bottas should be nicking a point, getting into doing what Gasly did in the Alpine. That's, I think, the best example. Gasly overachieved in the Alpine this weekend, did a great job to sneak into Q3 and score a point. That's what Bottas should be rewarded with on a weekend like this in the Sauber. But the car's so crap that 14th is genuinely a reflection of a Sauber overachieving, isn't it?
Yeah, which says a lot. The car's not miles and miles and miles off, but it is emphatically the weakest car. And yeah, the race for Sauber drivers is always just an exercise in how long it takes them to end up being on the bottom of the timing screens. And they were the last two finishers of those who didn't have random extra pit stops and problems, because of course Lawson and Perez finished behind them. But yeah, tough one for Valtteri to take.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Thursday Night Football is on, and it's only on Prime Video.
All the way for the touchdown.
This week, it's a Halloween treat as the Houston Texans take on the New York Jets.
What a catch.
Coverage begins at 7 p.m. Eastern with TNF Tonight, presented by Verizon. Not a Prime member? Sign up for a 30-day free trial to stream the game. It's the Texans and the Jets, Thursday at 7, only on Prime Video. Restrictions apply. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Right, as ever, the final part of the Race Review podcast is all about questions from listeners. Thanks to everyone who sent them in. If you'd like to join the Race Members Club, say you have question-asking powers, as well as all sorts of other benefits, click the link in the episode description or search for the race on Patreon. Mark, Sumnat Kasabi says, why didn't any of the drivers start on softs, given that the softer compound would have lasted for 20-odd laps and would be faster, giving more overtaking opportunities?
It would have been fast for a few laps, but over a stint, his average would have been slower than the medium. I'm still surprised that some, further back didn't try it and commit. You're committing to a two-stop with it, really. But it just wasn't figuring in anyone's pre-race simulations, and it was just its range was too short.
Scott. Steve D says, some have said that Lando Norris was weak in battle at Cota against Max, but did Mexico show that he has switched tactics and is trying to get under Max's skin and win psychologically as much as trying to beat him on track? And could that be his biggest strength in the final four races?
Well, Lando said on Thursday that he recognised that he hadn't been as strong or as perhaps as clever or ruthless as Max in wheel-to-wheel combat and needed to make some small changes. And I think we saw evidence of that, particularly the turn 4 move. He was more forceful, more committed to the move on the outside, knew what he needed to do within the racing guidelines and executed, and then quite rightly didn't let Max through when he rejoined ahead of him. I'd take no issue with what Norris did then a few corners later when Max dive-bombed him. I did wonder very, very, very briefly, I don't understand why Norris hasn't covered the inside there. Then you watch the replay and see just how quickly and far Verstappen flies off into the runoff, and you think, no, Norris is completely entitled to be surprised by that move because it's never happening in a million miles. I think the main thing that comes away from that is that Norris has effectively got one over on Verstappen now, and he's done it through kind of sticking to his guns with the kind of way that he wants to go racing. He could have pulled off a Sainz-style move, caught him out and dive-bombed him on the inside. But as I said earlier, with Sainz and the art of beating Verstappen, Norris has now found a way, which is basically don't get desperate. That was the instruction from team boss Andrea Stella. Don't go looking for justice on your terms. That's another thing that Stella said. Keep driving the way you're driving. Keep driving fair, and it will come to you. Either you will make the move, or you trust the stewards. You trust the third party to adjudicate and decide that Verstappen's the one that crossed the line. So I'm really pleased that he didn't yield. I'm glad that he was a bit more robust in the way that he attacked the corner. And about as far as advantages go for the final four races, don't think it necessarily gives him advantage because Verstappen is a damn hard person to overtake, even if he respects you and gives you what he considers to be fair racing room. But I think Verstappen, as a result of what's happened in Mexico, I think might treat Norris as a little bit less of a soft touch, whereas Austin had the air of, I've got you covered and I don't need to worry about you. And the Mexico defence sort of went a similar way, but it didn't work this time. And it's the first time it's not worked. So let's see if that changes things now. I don't think Max is going to make it easy for Lando by any means, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's just a touch more space and respect given now.
Question I'll take now from Jacobus VDL. Why was there no penalty or even investigation of the collision between Franco Colapinto and Liam Lawson? Actually, there was an investigation and there was a penalty. I don't blame you for not noticing that. I didn't know about it until I got back from the paddock into the media centre a couple of hours after the race. It was a 10-second penalty. Didn't change his finishing position. He was still 12th behind Lance Stroll. And the summary of it is that basically there was the turn 2 contact which damaged Liam Lawson's wing, which in itself wasn't the problem, but because Colapinto had attempted to overtake on the outside at turn 1, wasn't fully alongside at the apex and through the exit, the stewards deemed he wasn't entitled to racing room there, and then that then led to what happened at turn 2. So it's basically, yes, because Colapinto left the track and he wasn't entitled to, and then the collision happened, it was considered to be his fault. Mark, Jamie Stark says, what explains Leclerc's loss of pace on the medium stint? He seemed to be gaining on Sainz in the first few laps, but then lost a heap of time over the rest of the stint after Sainz's radio message. Was it a genuine loss of pace or a slowdown order from Ferrari?
It was to do with the very marginal cooling levels that Ferrari had chosen for its car, which was hand in hand with one of the reasons why they were so quick, because obviously the more marginal you go with the cooling on the power unit on the brakes, the faster the car is going to be, the better it is aerodynamically. And they were very confident that they were going to be running at the front, and they committed to that. And I think that was a decision made with their very much in regard to their championship challenge and the Constructors' Championship. They're throwing everything at it and just really, really going for it. And so that meant that if you weren't in the lead, it's one of the reasons why Sainz was absolutely determined to get past Verstappen. He wasn't going to wait around until the pit stops, because you really needed to be running that car in clear air, and otherwise you're going to have to back off so much. And that's what happened to Leclerc. He got the gap down, but in doing so, he got everything too hot, and he had to run the rest of that stint lifting and coasting, and quite a lot of the second stint. It takes a very long time to cool everything down, especially the brakes, and it was the brakes that were the issue, the brake calipers. And so it was that. It was just that. It was that he got everything so hot in reclaiming that time back to Sainz that he was forced into a much slower pace for probably the next 30-odd laps.
It's got a question from JK. Sergio Perez's days in F1 appear to be numbered. As a result, can the same be said of the Mexican Grand Prix? And if it can, which circuit would be first in line to replace it?
Tricky to judge. Obviously, Checo's presence and also his presence in a top team is a big part of what makes the Mexican Grand Prix so popular and so well attended. But there are other drivers that the fans here get very excited for. You mentioned Sainz earlier, but obviously Fernando Alonso as well. Franco Colapinto was talking about what a great reception he'd got in his obviously first Mexican Grand Prix for Williams in his stand-in role at the end of this season. So, given the event is quite popular as far as F1's concerned, and I think the promoters won awards for the quality of the job they've done putting it on. They've worked very hard to find ways to fund it. I think it's possible for the event to survive after Perez, but it really depends, because it is a race that used to rely on obviously state funding, relies more now on kind of a consortium basically of investors, maybe less minded to do that without a home hero and someone like Checo to really market and push everything forward. I would say it's not like the British Grand Prix, for example, is happening whether Lewis Hamilton's on the grid still in F1 or not, helped by the fact there are other Brits around as well. But it has a lot more kind of security and a stronger foundation. Mexican Grand Prix is more vulnerable. But it's just, I think if Perez disappears, it's going to be hard to drum up the kind of financial support, I think, to keep it going in the absolute long term. I think fan support would be all right. I don't think it would suddenly be empty grandstands, but it is, the key question would be whether or not the businesses and organisations and people that are actually making the event happen are willing to do that without someone like Checo on the grid.
Next up, a question from Nevin Knowles that I'll take. I feel there is a double standard with Ferrari. While Carlos is behind, he tries everything to overtake his teammate, but as soon as he is the one under pressure, he wants team orders and not to be attacked. Well, that's the double standards of every single driver on the grid. When they're ahead, of course, they want their teammate to be kept at bay, and when they're behind, they want to overtake. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think this isn't something Ferrari imposed. This is just the nature of racing drivers.
I think if you give me a racing driver that didn't do that, he wouldn't be a racing driver. That's it. That's just what you do.
Exactly. Next question mark for you from Chris Parrott. Can we say post-autumn mini break that Red Bull has recovered its one-lap pace, but is still behind Ferrari and McLaren on race pace?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. They definitely did make some progress with single lap pace in between Singapore and Austin. And it raised hopes among the Red Bull camp that they were, more or less back in play, especially after Max won that sprint race. But yeah, as you see a more representative Ferrari performance than we got to see in that sprint race, so it becomes pretty obvious that it's still it's the third best. It's clear of Mercedes, but it's still lagging behind those two cars. Yeah.
Scott, Michael Grayless asks, why didn't Sergio Perez get a penalty for forcing Lance Stroll off? It looks really similar to what happened between Max and Lando.
Yeah, Perez had quite the dramatic Grand Prix, didn't he? Between the Lawson incident, which got no further action, and obviously his false start. But with the Stroll incident, I think that was down to that was simply down to car positioning. We obviously talk quite a lot about the position at the apex and sort of where people are required to give room or not. I think the argument was basically that Stroll was never fully alongside, so he wasn't entitled to room at the exit. It's just another one of those things where position at the apex of the corner governs all else. So yeah, Perez, no punishment there. Was investigated, forcing another driver off the track, but no further action because it was his corner, essentially.
Rob Browning asks, a question on pit stop penalties. When serving a penalty, you can't work on the car, therefore no mechanic can touch the car. I noticed, however, one of the Red Bull mechanics was pumping cool air into the duct of the car during Max Verstappen's penalty stop whilst not touching it. Could this be classed as working on the car? Considering Max had a 20-second penalty, this would have given him a sizable advantage over the others to cool the engine. Yeah, you can't work on the car, but this is allowed basically because if you can have a car just sat there, not moving, no air going through it, it's not just a bit of a performance advantage, but you're going to get things overheating. Obviously, brakes have a tendency to catch fire if you exactly. So it's just a pragmatic thing that I don't think it helps. It's not really an advantage, other than it just stops things going very, very, very badly wrong. Mark, a question from Hayden Hodgson: do you think, or have you heard anything from the paddock that Ferrari might be regretting letting Carlos go for Lewis Hamilton?
No, I don't. I wouldn't expect to hear anything, even if that was being muted inside the team. But I doubt that it is. You make your choices, and you go forward from there. You don't really think about what you should have done when you're already committed to a plan of action. That's who they've decided to go with, and everything will be focused on making that work.
Scott, Jack Lund says, I loved Liam Lawson not giving Perez an inch, as if showing him who is taking his seat. Will this encourage Red Bull to put him in the car next year?
I mentioned earlier, I think the fact that Red Bull didn't chastise Lawson for racing the senior team's car and damaging the senior team's car speaks volumes. It very, very strongly implies, I definitely think we can infer from this, that Lawson didn't defy any order not to race Perez. And I reckon Marco in particular, because it's just what Marco's like, will have appreciated the aggression and the desire to race the way he did. And I agreed with the stewards' decision. I don't think this needed a penalty against Lawson. The main thing I was amused by in all of this was when Lawson gave Perez the middle finger while overtaking him, and seemed to realise after the race that was a misstep that he needed to apologise for. I think it was quite sincere as well. It was very much a heat of the moment thing. But no, I think Lawson, I disagreed with Perez's claim that Lawson doesn't have the right attitude, needs to show more respect and be more humble and this and that. I didn't really see a great issue with what Lawson did. Perez has been so slow this weekend. And Lawson was ahead of him on merit at the time, and they were on the same strategy and they were in a race with each other. Lawson was totally entitled to race against him. And when you throw in the situational element that Lawson's gunning for his seat, he's not going to just roll over. So yeah, I was happy with what Lawson did.
Adam Sargent with a question now that I'll take. Does Pierre Gasly have a more updated car than Esteban Ocon, or is he outperforming him by that far? Yes, this weekend they had the same car spec. Last weekend Gasly had the update, but Ocon didn't. Actually, Ocon was looking a little bit quicker throughout practice, going into qualifying, but a bit of understeer in qualifying. And then Gasly just getting everything together, nailed it, got into Q3. Absolutely superb, and then a really, really good race. But yeah, Gasly, I think, is actually having quite an impressive season. He has had a more impressive season overall than Ocon. And yeah, a much-deserved point after a very fine weekend. Mark, next question for you. I haven't written down who this is from. I'll check while you answer it. Was this a weekend where Kevin Magnussen showed he is a lot better than some people think he is? He was superb all weekend.
He was. And the thing with Kevin is that he really needs the car to be absolutely as he needs it, and with a very nice stable rear end that he can really lean on. And then he's very quick and very consistent, and we know how good he is in battle, very tough, and when everything is right with Kevin's world, he's very, very good indeed. But that only seems to happen in about half the races. So and Hulkenberg's come in this year and exposed that.
And while you're answering that, I didn't manage to dig up who asked that. Many apologies for not crediting you. But I would say that this really was a fine weekend for Magnussen, certainly his best of the season. And yeah, really, really strong performance. He's had some really strong weekends in Mexico in the past, actually. And yeah, just shows how frustrating he is, because yeah, he needs to have that rhythm and feel, and he can be brilliant, but he just can't deliver it regularly enough. So I don't think it shows he's a lot better than some people think he is. I think it just confirms how frustrating a driver he can be, because I think there's so much there when things are coming together, but it just doesn't come together often enough. Scott, Andrew Ferg, did McLaren actually think they get anything out of the right of review, or do we think they did it to prove the overtaking rules needed updating again? Now, this refers, of course, to the USA petition for right of review. You could probably talk for 10 minutes on this, but yeah, probably the short answer's best. Yeah,
I'll do quick fire. They did think they had a chance. I think they were hopeful but not expectant. They were basically trying to force a new precedent, because there is no past example of a steward's document itself, just the existence of a document itself effectively counting as a new element. But their argument was that the steward's document was what revealed the error that they were trying to correct, or the cause of the reason for the error that they were trying to correct. So that's why they thought they had half a chance at making that happen. Their objective was to get in the room and be able to argue that the perspective with which the stewards judged that incident in Austin from was incorrect, because McLaren felt that they should have judged it from the point of view of Norris getting ahead, and therefore Verstappen being the driver overtaking on the inside, which would have meant different guidelines applied. Verstappen would have had to stay on the track, and Norris shouldn't have had the penalty, so overturn the penalty, and then Norris beats Verstappen in Austin. Obviously, it failed, so that was unfortunate. And just to make absolutely crystal clear, in case anyone was wondering, because we had another race, another clash between Norris and Verstappen, another penalty, Red Bull shouldn't be petitioning for a right of review after this one. Horner said they won't. But then again, Andrea Stella said that on the Sunday evening after the US Grand Prix, and then McLaren went ahead and bloody did it anyway. So let's wait and see. I don't think it's coming. I have now discovered it was Thomas Knight, who I didn't credit for the Magnussen question, so I've caught up on that.
Right, Jan Alexander says apart from Antonelli and Behrman, who, if any of the other FP1 stand-ins, has the potential to make it in F1. Jordan Stover asks, can you do a breakdown of the young drivers that ran in FP1 this weekend? And Ollie Emerson asks, why did so many teams choose Mexico for their FP1 rookie outings? Well, on the last point, FP1's a fairly rubbish session in Mexico because it's a really green track, so close to the end of the season, middle of doubleheader, quite a good time to do it. Mexico's had quite a few FP1 runs in the past, so that's why 5 teams did it. In terms of who has the potential to make it in F1, any of those other drivers, obviously it's 3 because Antonelli and Behrman are being promoted. The other 3, which is Felipe Drugovich, Robert Schwartzman and Pato O'Ward, the IndyCar driver, they're all drivers who could have the potential to do well in F1, but they're not going to get the opportunity to race in F1 unless something unforeseen happens. And just in terms of a quick overview of them, I followed Kimi Antonelli closely. He had a very deliberately quiet and conservative FP1. Nothing went wrong. He ran over a bit of debris and picked up a tiny bit of floor damage. That wasn't his fault. But he was quite conservative in the high speed. Exactly what he needed. Quiet, unobtrusive, solid. Didn't lob it into the barrier, so good for him. Pato O'Ward was under strict instructions not to crash because he had the one example of the McLaren flaw on the car. He did not crash. He was careful. He said he couldn't do his normal go over the limit to find it approach. So, yeah, tidy job from him. And Robert Schwartzman, frustrating time in the Sauber in that red flags were getting in his way. He had a DRS problem that messed up what would have been his best lap. And he managed to get a 5-place grid penalty that he will almost certainly never serve for overtaking Yuki Tsunoda under the yellow flag after there was that clash between Behrman and Albon in FP1. Scott, you followed a couple of the others closely, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was trying to follow Behrman, but obviously I didn't get much in FP1 because he had that clash with Albon, which was bizarre, and I think actually Ferrari's radio comms was the main antagonist of that, as well as Albon losing control and then smacking into the Ferrari. So nothing you could really learn from Behrman this time. And Drugovich, I think the best way to describe Drugovich's session is he was driving an Aston Martin. So he had the quintessential driving an Aston Martin in Formula 1 experience in 2024. He had understeer in some corners, oversteer in other corners. It was a tricky car to drive. But overall, his pace was actually quite good. And once you corrected, I think it was only a couple of attempts off of Lance Stroll, once you corrected for the final sector that got ruined by traffic and then apply what he was capable of in that final sector, I think he was basically on Stroll's pace, if not a bit quicker. So Drugovich did, in the words of Tom McCulloch at Aston Martin, pretty much what he's done every time he's ever got into an Aston Martin, which is looked very professional, done a perfectly competent job, been pretty quick, but you're on it's not hiding to nothing on FP1, but Drugovich isn't a fan of them, and not just because he's having to drive an Aston Martin, which isn't very good, just because they're so limited in what you can show. So yeah, he did a perfectly fine job, but it's not going to be career defining.
And just to sign off, Stephen Long says, Ed, now we've established your love for buying hats at the track, fans must know, did you buy a trackside sombrero in Mexico? No, I did not. I still had the cap that I gained by happenstance in Austin, so I'm all right for that. I didn't see any sombreros on sale, but maybe that's one for next year. Well, thanks to everyone who sent in questions. We'll tackle more of those in the midweek podcast. Thanks to Scott and Mark as well. Of course, still one leg of the triple header to come, so stay with us as we head to Brazil.
The Athletic.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.